They're like, oh.
Especially if it works about yourself.
So is it name, age?
Very quickly, that's not my forte.
My photographs are always rubbish, but I actually think in a way that's better. Hi, I'm Jenna Waldren. I'm 22. I'm originally from London, and I'm now an artist working and living in Edinburgh. I feel like I didn't really come from a very artistic family. Like my dad's a picture framer, so he's artistic in the sense that he knows how to frame things and he deals with a lot of art, but in terms of like as a person, he's not very interested in it. So I remember just like looking at all of these artists that I love, and I went to loads of galleries and I was like, what do I like? Who do I like? Why do I like what they like? And what they do and what they say. And there were a few female artists that stood out to me, which was Chantal Joff, Paula Modison-Becker. It was women that were either depicting their own pregnancy or their own motherhood, or what it was to be women. So for my dissertation, I wrote about Paula Modison-Becker's first, it's called Self-Portrait at 6th Wedding Anniversary, and it's the first painting that we know of by a Western woman depicting herself naked. So a lot of my research in the first sort of half of my last year was about this idea of the active versus the passive, and the idea of, historically men being the active and the woman being the passive, and how she, by painting herself, was potentially one of the first to, kind of take on that role. So yeah, it kind of made me reflect like where I was at that point, where I was at as a woman, and like what point in my life I was at. And so I sort of started looking at the moments that were around me. And I remember speaking to some tutors about the idea of how, being a young person sharing flats with sort of 4 or 5 other people is like a very like interesting and unique experience. So I was kind of like looking at that and kind of picking out these strange moments that we all have when we're sort of sharing these flats. So kind of, brushing your teeth or someone's on the toilet, repotting plants on the kitchen floors. It's kind of like these weird moments that we all share. I think there's a lot to be said as well about like female friendship and female support. And I think when you live with 4 other women, as I did, it's interesting how you just all support each other in different ways. And I think that's really nice. So I think that's what kind of led me to record these sort of moments. I do feel like I pay a lot of attention to the objects around me. That's why I think the Glen Street series was such an interesting thing to do, was because it was just this flat, and that's all I worked from for like 6 months. And it was like, right, well, let's look at something that I've never thought about looking at. Let's look at the hallway. What's in the hallway? Oh, there's a switch there, and there's a switch there, and there's a radiator there. And I think just by like making an effort to fully like photograph, because I work from photographs, every inch of the flat, I think definitely the objects that are in the paintings are as important as the colour. Because my work is quite representational and quite overt, maybe, I need to find a way as an artist or as a painter to kind of make it more than just a copy of a photograph. And I want like my own visual language to go through it and run through it. So colour definitely plays a significant role in that. Actually, what's quite interesting about the Glen Street series is I asked my flatmates to each pick a colour palette from a little book that I have. And in the book, I just said to them, like, pick a colour swatch or a series of swatches that you feel represents you, represents, the clothes you wear, anything that feels relevant to you. And then, yeah, I made colour swatches for each individual room. So Charlotte's room had a colour palette that reflected her and like her personality and what she felt like she wanted to be represented in. And then I did the same for Holly. When you look at the paintings, I hope when you look through all of them, it feels like there's a cohesive colour theory through them. I think my work is very subtle, and I think my work is quite, if you looked at it, it might not be obvious what I'm trying to say or what I'm trying to do. So I do value personally for my art an aesthetic as well as a concept. So I want my work to be visually interesting because I am a painter. Otherwise, if it was all about concept, maybe I wouldn't be a painter. Because I think for me, the medium is as important and the visual is as important as the concept. I definitely say that film influences me. especially within domestic settings, I find it really interesting how they'll use like a wall or a plinth or a pillar to divide up the scenes. And I think that's kind of, those sorts of compositional tools are things that probably I use as reference in my own work. I was already kind of in the domestic sphere. I was already looking at the ideas around that, it was more, I think, at that point, kind of a record of what was happening around me. And then obviously COVID hit, and it was like, it put all this pressure on what the domestic meant and how people were interpreting that. So I think rather than like shying away from those comparisons and those like, what people thought my work was about, I was like, right, let's go for it and let's make this insular and let's make this really much about like what I'm experiencing right now in this sort of lockdown period. I think it actually positively impacted it, because I think if you look at the series of works, they all feed off each other, and you can tell that they're a series made together. Whereas my work that I'm working on at the moment is a series of images that I've collected over the summer. So where we've got like our freedom back and we can see different people and we can have these sort of joyful memories. They feel like living autobiographies in a way. That's a quote from a writer called Deborah Levy, who writes sort of autobiographies every 10 years. In those books, she sort of talks about how they feel like they're living autobiographies because they're constantly evolving and constantly changing. So I feel like my work coming out of the COVID period is still evolving, but it feels quite freer and quite hopeful. Not being able to have an art studio has made me appreciate this space so much. It makes me want to come in all the time. It makes me want to make art all the time, because I feel like it feels like so much more of a luxury. If I could give any advice to anyone at art school, it would be actually go in and make use of the studios and appreciate that and make friends and make community and put on shows and do stuff like that, because the best stuff you'll ever learn is from your peers.
There's something really special about that. It's just like, because quite often in history, like history of art, women don't ever, like, it's always the male gaze, it's always like men depicting how women are seen in paintings, and for you to like actually like get consent from these women you're painting, and like also ask them how they want to be seen rather than just like how you see them, it sort of makes that relationship you have with the subject so much more intimate. And yeah, it's really like personal paintings. They're so beautiful. That's so nice to hear. Cool. Right, do we want to have a wee nosy around? Do you want a biscuit?
Yeah, why not? Thank you.
They look amazing.